Dave, you've got one of the most cited HBR articles on management and decision making. I just wanted to ask you about leadership literature and your thoughts on contemporary literature and theories.
Okay, that's a big subject, right? I mean, I think the key thing the Harvard article did was to identify that leaders take different actions in different contexts. And I think that was what made it unique. It won an Academy of Management Award as well as a practitioner paper, which was nice. So I say it's got a very high citation level. And I think it was because of that sort of context-free, not context-specific point. It basically said, here you do this, here you do that. Now, you've got 2 or 3 problems with contemporary leadership theory. One is it tends to focus on the leader. All right, so I can quote half a dozen books. There are people who, for some reason, everybody acknowledges as great leaders. So people like Steve Jobs at Apple, Lou Gerstner at IBM.
The trait-based, the heroes,
the trait-based, the heroes,
romanticization, innate leadership.
And I've worked with some of those guys. I've worked with GM, all right, and they've got nothing in common apart from generally being arrogant bastards who get away with murder, all right. But you don't be an arrogant bastard and get away with murder and you could become a leader. You put all these lovely sort of platitudes, into the system. So you find people who will take people who are completely different and just shoehorn them into a framework of qualities or traits and say this is a new approach to leadership. And if they've been really pretentious, they put radical in front of it to try and imply it's new. And we've been doing variations on that for years. And I think there are 2 or 3 things which are different on this. So I remember when I applied to become a general manager, I was, wanted to move from team leader. And the company then actually had a strict rule. It said you had to do a year in sales, a year in production, and a year in support before you could go on the general management program, and you had to hit your targets. Right? Because the argument was without that experience, you didn't know what to manage. And I still remember I automatically qualified for the production because that's what I've been doing. But the year I spent in sales was horrendous. I mean, you suddenly realize what it's like to know you can't pay the mortgage if you don't close a sale in the next 24 hours. And that's a whole different way in which you frame your experience. And if you sit on a support line, you realize you can't take the average length of a call, multiply it by the number of calls, divide it by the available hours and say that's what staffing we want. But it doesn't work like that, all right? And processes don't work except for certain very defined tasks. They don't work for others. So when we came out of that 3 years, we understood things in a radically different way. And it's quite interesting. If I go into an American hospital, you generally find when you go to meet the person in charge of it that they're wearing the equivalent of a white coat because they also are they're generally doctors. Whereas in British hospitals, they're professional managers. And that changes. It's like if you go back to the House series, it's the Cully figure, and there's a whole conference for them, which I've spoken at, is they may not be the best doctors, but they understand what it's like to be a doctor, so they're able to make decisions more effectively. So that issue about experience and understanding context, I think, is key to leadership. The other thing is every good leader I've ever seen takes good people with them. I've done it myself. You find people you can work with, generally people who complement your strengths. Yeah, and what you've effectively got is what we know as a crew. So crews are used extensively in military environments, in civil contingency environments, and in hospitals. So in a crew comprises a series of defined roles, and how the roles interact is defined. So you're trained in role and you're trained in role interaction, and generally the entry into the role is highly ritualized. It's this cognitive trigger. And a crew has cognitive capacity which is higher than that of the individuals put together. So one of the things I've started to experiment with is a leadership crew. So there's always a pilot, but who the pilot is can change. You're not dependent on this one individual. So I think we're starting to see leadership as something which is almost like a catalyst or an instantiation of a complex weaving of different interactions and experiences over time. And if you look at the EU Field Guide, it says one of the key aspects of being a leader is actually the only time you ever make a decision is in a real crisis. And then you make decisions to hold options open, not to resolve the problem. And the minute you can, you actually distribute decision making, but you centralize coordination. Your role as a leader is coordinate and link because you no longer have the capacity to make those decisions. And you see good leaders do this. They've always got time, and they've also got reflective capacity. I remember working with one guy at Boeing, who's an ex-test pilot who is now a very senior guy at Boeing. And he would spend a week every year, I got invited to run it, where he would take his senior management team away from all operational contact. No contact was allowed, and I was there to give them words they never understood with more syllables than they experienced to make them think. And if anybody's business required them to be present during that week, they were fired because they were obviously incapable of managing their business. So the role of the leader there was the reflector, the connector, the linkage. And another example on this, one of my favourite companies I ever worked with was Blue Water, which was an Australian construction company when it was run by Stuart with Neville and Malcolm and all those guys. Sorry, they were great guys. I still remember, and they beat me up properly the first day. They asked me a question. I said, "That's a good question." And Neville turned around to me and said, "I didn't ask you to rate my question, you pommy bastard. I asked you to answer it." And that sort of set the flavour, right? But what they did is they had 3 really experienced project managers. They didn't have many reports. They flew around the world. They met with project teams. The project teams did a report, and basically, I mean, the phrase they came up for it, the corporate seagull comes in and shits all over you. So whatever you said, they could find something wrong with it. But they would never give you a solution. They'd connect you to somebody who might have a solution. So it was part of that culture, and their role was to link and connect and challenge, not to actually do. And that to me was a really valuable lesson.
So that's the difference then between the managers and the leaders being able to make those calls, make those decisions, and link those people up then.
Yeah, though I'm never wild about the leadership management dichotomy, because I think all leaders manage and all managers should lead, all right? And again, I think that there's a real problem on this. Western thinking is too dominated by young archetypes in the hero's journey. And it's a good way of producing a film script. I was watching Harry Potter last night, because you watch Harry Potter when you're tired and you've got nothing better to do, and that's a classic example of the hero's journey. I still remember my son getting very angry with me when I said, you know that Dumbledore's going to die in the next book, don't you? Because the mentor has to leave. I mean, these are structures, all right? And we have this liking for that sort of structure. The trouble is, what makes a good script for a film doesn't make a good process for leadership. And the stress on a leader to be the hero to make all the decisions is a mistake. But the recognition that sometimes you have to be draconian, sometimes you have to be consultative. One of the worst things which I think has happened in leadership is these sort of single behaviour focus, like people talk about servant leadership.
Yeah? Oh, and the gardener. And
the gardener. So it's kind of like, and the answer is, well, yes, sometimes you wash people's feet and sometimes you chop them off. Sorry, that's what you do as a leader, right?
Yeah, it's depending what domain you're in.
Dependent on the
you're
context.
Command and control, sometimes you're the gardener, sometimes you're X, Y, Z. Okay, interesting. So what's your thoughts then on how leaders, so not everyone in a positional leadership role is a leader. You can have leaders in non-authoritative roles. How does that play out in the system?
I think this is where we're starting to look at this, from a complex systems perspective. In the Harvard article, which is over 10 years old now, we were really still in the sort of systems thinking domain, so it was written for people in that background. I think we can now be more radical. So we know that in certain contexts, you might move to a distributed form of leadership. The concept of leadership trios, which is something we're working with, put 3 people together from a different background. We developed a thing called a triopticon, in which experts from different backgrounds can have a highly orchestrated dispute, and the leader can observe the dispute before they make a decision. So seeing the leader as part of a complex ecology of interactions, I think, is where we're now going. And seeing leadership as a distributed function, which ironically links in with modern knowledge about human consciousness. We now know that consciousness is not co-located with the brain. It's a distributed function of the brain, the body, its social interactions, its collective narrative. And I think that's the same sort of discourse we're going through. We're moving from the leader as an individual, the brain as the conquering entity, into something which recognises this what I call messy coherence, which is one of my favourite phrases.
Yeah, so we're moving away from the leader being one person, the power being with them, and the power being more distributed. And anyone in the organisation could be a leader as long as they've got someone to follow them.
Not only that, I think it's also putting leadership into process. So trios is actually not making anybody a leader, it's creating a process through which leadership can be exercised.
So one thing I'd like to ask you about is VUCA and leadership and how those two things link together.
Yeah, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And it really took off when the military picked it up. And I think it's a way of recognizing a situation. I think it's a description. The trouble is, it doesn't tell you much what to do with it. Yeah. So if it's volatile, well, whether it's volatile in the sense of being a complex system or a complicated system is highly significant. Complex might mean complicated. Yeah, so I think VUCA is a way of getting people's attention to the fact that life isn't structured and highly regulated and reductionist, but it doesn't give us a mechanism through which we can change things. I think that's where we get into Cynefin and everything else.
So it's a precursor for Cynefin.
It's a thing we live with, all right?
Okay.
I think it's, you can say it's a way in which people realised the world was more uncertain than they thought, and therefore you can reference it, and you can say, okay, and actually now most people don't even remember what the individual letters stand for. It's a VUCA world. It's become a noun. So you can say, if you're in a VUCA world, then we do these sort of things.
Right, okay. The other thing that I wanted to ask you about then was OODA.
The OODA loop.
The OODA loop.
Yeah, this was actually something I started working with in knowledge management. James, who was an ex-Navy officer, taught it me. So it was used a lot in military warfare. And it was originally developed in the Korean War. And it was about maneuverability over speed. So basically the Russian MiGs, which the North Koreans had, were faster than the American F, whatever they were then. But the F could turn faster. And that maneuverability gave them strategic advantage. So OODA stands for Observe, Orientate, Decide and Act. Yeah? Now the first time I used OODA, I used what's called a double circle version of it, not a single circle. So it basically says, I observe where I am. Let's take the example I normally give. So I look at a street name if I'm in London. Mm-hmm. I then orientate myself to the map. I look up the street name in the index. That gives me a grid reference. I know where I am. I then can make a decision. Yeah. So observe, orientate, decide. Well, I'll walk down that street for 3 blocks and turn right for 3 blocks. And when I reach the river, I'll look at the map again. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then I act on that. So that's that loop. On the other hand, if I flag down a black taxi and get in it and say I want to go there, the fact the taxi driver is going through the OODA loop continuously, not explicitly. So if you try and drive across London with a map, you will always be beaten by a taxi driver. And we made that point very strongly. Is it a problem for a taxi driver or a map user? Because map users are easier to train. Taxi drivers take a long time to train. The knowledge takes a minimum of 2 years to acquire if you're a London taxi driver. The hippocampus of London taxi drivers is physically extended over ordinary human beings, and that's a 2-year process. Yeah? So that was a powerful thing. Now, just before lockdown, we actually ran a whole session on this at Quantico, which is where Boyd was based, who created OODA. And we got into the Boyd libraries and looked at his notebooks and everything like that, so it was a lot of fun. Yeah. I should say at the time I didn't know I had a massive brain bleed, so I wasn't on my best form, but this is life, right? And one of the things which has come out of that is a mapping of OODA to Cynefin. So the critical thing in the OODA loop is actually that orientate phase. Observation can be automated, decisions can be structured, action is there, but the key thing is how do you orientate? So it's almost like the way I'm now picturing it, and we're getting somebody to draw this at the moment, is the OODA loop is actually normally drawn as a straight line, observe, orientate, decide and act. And the orientate has multiple interactions. So what we do is it's almost like we put Cynefin as a disk through that line, and the Cynefin framework changes its orientation as it goes down the line from observation, orientation, decision, action. So we effectively use Cynefin as a way of increasing the epistemological options available to people on the stages as they go through the OODA loop.
So like a kaleidoscope, so wherever they are, it slightly shifts.
You got it.
And you're looking around it that way, so it makes sense wherever you are.
Yeah, and then the context may change that, right? So I think that then gets quite interesting. And, we got stuff where we're co-teaching that things at the moment. And I think OODA loop is such an easy idea for people to grasp. The trouble is people reduce it to algorithms, to mechanical approaches, to simple circles. And they assume that they make this rational myth, which is something Boyd never made the mistake of. They assume you can make it all rational, and actually you can't. If you ever work with fighter pilots, they haven't got time to think objectively. They're just got to make decisions. Yeah.